Hello and welcome back to the Troutman Pepper Battery Storage Podcast. In today's episode, we have the co-founder and chief executive officer of Bushveld Energy, Mr. Mikhail Nikomarov. He is the chief executive officer of Bushveld Energy. Welcome, Mikhail.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, excellent. Well, we've had a lot of different perspectives on the podcast before. I know you've listened to at least one of the episodes. We've had a lot on sort of policy issues and then short duration, lithium ion. We've had at least one other on long duration storage. And the reason why I mention that is because I think your company is definitely in the space of the long duration storage, and in particular as well dealing with vanadium. So I was wondering if you could give me a brief introduction of yourself and your company, and then we can start the conversation talking about vanadium and long duration storage.
Sure, thanks. I can do that. So about myself, I think you started with that. So I run Bushveld Energy. It's a company I co-founded in 2015, although we started talking about the idea in 2014. Bushveld Energy is the energy business of Bushveld Minerals, which is a London-listed vanadium minerals company. We're an integrated company, which means that we do exploration for vanadium. We mine vanadium in South Africa. We process vanadium into kind of higher value-added vanadium products, most of which go into the steel sector. That's where most of the vanadium is consumed. And so in 2014, the CEO of the group and I started to think about, are there other uses of vanadium that we could look at? And we saw an emerging application in stationary storage, specifically in a technology called vanadium redox flow, which is a type of flow battery. And so we pitched a concept to the board, and we started the business in 2015, formally actually launched in 2016. And right now, there's basically three verticals underneath the business. One is around electrolyte, where we're building a manufacturing plant in South Africa to make the electrolyte, which is the most expensive component in the battery. It's a liquid electrolyte. We've got a vanadium rental product that we rolled out about a year ago, and I think that's also something you've discussed before. We've also made investments into a number of battery companies. So we ourselves do not have a battery. So unlike some others, we've actually taken an approach where we work with the industry. We've invested in a Canadian company that then merged with a UK company, and they formed Infinity Energy. And we've made another recent investment into a company in Austria called CellCube. And then we also have a project development team. So we've got actually a team that looks at developing projects, similar to what you'd hear from like solar developers or wind developers. But the difference is we look at it as to, where does a project actually need storage to either, meet a specific need or actually couple together with renewable energy. That's kind of a different spin on it. At the moment, that's, I think that the understanding of storage is a bit more limited. So that allows us to kind of play in a market that is not as saturated as the solar and wind developers. Just one thing, two things I also mention is that's my private sector hat. I've got a couple of non-private sector hats as well, which I think is helpful as context. So I also chair the South Africa Energy Storage Association, and that's a nonprofit association. And then I also chair the Energy Storage Committee of Vanatech, which is the global association of vanadium producers. And I think you actually had one of those members of Vanatech on a podcast a few weeks ago as well. So that was exciting to hear.
No, that's great to hear, and yes, we had your colleague at another vanadium producer and battery company, Palo Misk. So good to have another member of Vanatech on as well. And yes, I kind of breezed over your introduction, so I appreciate you going into detail and also mentioning the Energy Storage Association for South Africa. And talking about your company's model, which is actually a little bit different than the other company that we had on, that there's certain things I think that are in common with the vanadium rental product model, maybe. But it is interesting that you, in terms of the actual batteries, you make investments in battery companies, and it sounds like you sort of partner with them. and then you've got, like you said, a project development team. So in terms of your project development team, and it's obviously you've done a lot of thinking on the long duration issues and how vanadium batteries, flow batteries, can play in this space. What do you see coming down the pike in the United States? And I guess by that I mean, you've seen now, like California, for instance, went out with a procurement where they mentioned the need for long duration products. And there's obviously a lot of RFPs that come out around the United States. A lot of them have been focused on where they'll just say solar plus storage, or renewables plus storage, but they don't get as granular, mentioning the difference between short duration and long, or they don't specify lithium ion versus something else. What do you see coming in terms of procurement efforts, RFPs for resources and the like? And obviously the market that I'm in is the United States, but feel free to discuss other markets as well.
Well, I mean, I think the U.S. market is very important. It is actually where storage's participation in the market in the power sector kind of started, and it wasn't by accident, right? This was something that the Department of Energy intentionally prioritized, and I think it was in 2008 that they actually first started to help write some rules, and it was probably in the PJM market where storage could participate more in the frequency control and short duration. And a lot of those rules were written with the technology that was available at the time, which was the emerging kind of lithium and to some degree lead acid batteries that could play in that, and then that spread to CAISO in California. And if you think about the trend, I think the trend over the past clearly 5 years, or probably even longer than that, has been moving from shorter duration to longer duration. The most obvious application that I think enabled that was the ability of storage to bid into capacity markets. So all of a sudden, you weren't just bidding on a 5 or a 10 or 15-minute window. You could actually bid on a much longer window that was traditionally occupied by gas. And the great thing about storage is if you've got the duration, you can cover both what a gas peaker plant will do, and also what it can't do, which is very quick ramp up and ramp down, which is ideal. So I think what you're then seeing is a change in the duration of the average U.S. battery. And I think in 2016, it was something like 2/3 of an hour. And then the most recent data I saw from the U.S. Energy Storage Association was around 2 hours, right? So 2 hours is the duration. That's on average, which means that there's still quite a few of those 15-minute, half-hour batteries and a lot more of the 4-hour batteries. The question is, do you stop at 4 hours, which is kind of, I think, a little bit of a sweet spot for where lithium kind of ends, or do you need longer? And our premise is that you need more longer duration than you need even the 4 hours. And there was a report out by NREL which basically said that you need more. Most of what you need is actually about 8 hours. You need some 6 hours, and then you need some 4 hours. So actually, most of your stationary storage is going to be in that still daily cycling, right? But 6 to 8 hours, definitely some 4 hours. The stuff that is short duration is a very small percentage of the market, probably in the long term about 7%, something like that, not more. So you really need 4-hour systems, 6-hour systems, 8-hour systems, possibly some 10-hour systems, and that's for your daily cycling. On top of that, you also actually need some weekly storage and then some seasonal storage, which batteries are probably not well positioned to provide just because it's kind of an inefficient use of the tech. But that's how I think the market is evolving, and that does bode well for companies in the long duration tech.
That's great to run through all that. And I have mentioned before on the program that I was involved with a complaint involving MISO where we challenged MISO's market rules, and long story short, we got Order 841 that I think grew out of that. And Order 841 is the FERC order where they talk about how you have to have a storage market participation model, which goes to the energy market. But on the capacity side, the Order 841 says, look, you have to make the market rules such that the storage can participate in all the markets that it can technically qualify for. On the capacity side, the way that's playing out, and that's an important piece that you mentioned, MISO, for instance, has a 4-hour rule that if you can provide energy for 4 hours at the peak, you can qualify for capacity. PJM was at a 10-hour rule, but that I think there's a movement to change that to make it shorter. But to pardon the pun, but the long and the short of it is that I think those capacity accreditation rules are going to end up somewhere in that 4-hour range, probably, which is interesting because my understanding is that's sort of at the outer edge of where lithium ion would be, but kind of in the middle maybe for the sort of flow battery long duration systems. But the flow battery long duration systems can go out as long as 10 plus hours. So I think it's interesting how that debate will play out. I think in terms of the non-capacity energy products, market rules are one thing in the RTOs, but California, I think in one of the previous episodes I mentioned that California, there was a trade press article where they talked about how curtailments are now down a little bit in terms of the renewables, and that's good news. And they accredited storage for helping with that curtailment issue. So I think you're going to see that picture improve. And maybe you could just talk for a minute about how long duration can really address that duck curve, the so-called California duck curve issue, and other issues with how renewables ramp compared to the peak and compared to the curve, basically.
Yeah, well, I mean, so I think one of the great things about if you have a technology like, let's say, a vanadium redox flow battery, right, that gives you the cost competitiveness for long duration, you can still use it for short duration applications, which are more power applications. So, it's not that it's one or the other. Once you're able to do 6 hours and you're cost effective on 6 hours, nothing stops you from at other points in the day, running just for 15 minutes. And actually, I want to come back to that point because there's another benefit of the tech that I think is a little bit underutilized because of how market rules are structured. But the big difference between a flow battery and more of solid batteries that we're used to, whether they're, the alkaline batteries that we had in our flashlights when we were all younger before there was lithium ion, or the lithium ion batteries in our phones and increasing electric vehicles, is that those types of batteries, the power and the energy scale together. I kind of use the analogy of a car where you have an engine which tells you how powerful the car is, how fast it can go, how much torque, a truck can generate. But it's the gas tank that determines how far you can actually get with the power that the engine produces. So if you want to go far, having a really powerful engine is not helpful. Having a really large gas tank is really helpful. And in lithium-ion batteries, you increase the engine, and you have to proportionally increase the gas tank. In a flow battery, you don't have to do that. Literally, the tanks are separate from the engine, and so that means it's cheaper because you don't have to have a bigger engine just because the only thing you care about is a larger gas tank. So as a result, the technology becomes cheaper per megawatt hour or kilowatt hour as you go to longer duration. And certainly, there's nothing stopping one technology to be used for the application of the other, but it does come down to economics and what makes sense commercially, which is why when you only had 1 hour or half hour needs, you would not have used a flow battery, outside of very specific applications, and we can come back to those. But as the need comes more and more for 6 hours, 8 hours, 10 hours, now all of a sudden it makes a lot of sense. So that's really the key part around the technology. There are other benefits, which I think you've discussed before. In terms of non-degradation, it's a completely reversible chemical reaction. So you don't have these little pathways that the ions create in a solid battery. In a liquid battery, those pathways they just don't exist. So you don't have degradation of the chemistry. Yes, the other components do wear out, so there is a lifetime to the battery, but it's not the chemistry. So you can keep reusing the electrolyte almost theoretically to infinity, or you can take the vanadium out and repurpose the vanadium for something else if you for some reason can't reuse the electrolyte. So that's a big advantage. But But the one that I think is not utilized enough is this non-degradation, because the other thing you can do with the technology is you have the use case, you can cycle it a lot. So it can be a workhorse battery as well, whereas lithium has a degradation, although, in fairness, those technologies are also getting better. But if you have a high cycling need, then there's an advantage there of also using a flow battery, because you're not worried that you might have to use the battery 3 times rather than 1 time per day, which is great, because then you're not worried about your warranties, you're not worried about having to augment it in 3 years rather than in 5 or 7 years. So all of those things are pluses, but do you have enough use cases where you can actually cycle, even let's say a 4-hour battery, multiple times per day? And unless you've got regulations that allow for capturing a lot of values by a storage system, you actually don't have that a lot of time. In South Africa, for example, we used to have a dual peak. We had a morning peak of demand, and we had an evening peak of demand. That's flattened out a little bit over the last few years, but that was a good application where you could have charged the battery in the morning, then the sun comes up, and that's your peak generation from solar energy. Then the sun goes down, and you again need storage, and then at night you've got what used to be called base load. So there are those kind of applications, but really the better way is to have stack values from a system. And I have 5 or 6 values, some of which are daily usage, some of which might be once a week, and some of which, when the system really needs it. And if you can have a regulatory structure where I can generate from one battery or from one electron 5 or 6 different value streams, then that's a very good case for flow batteries as well.
Well, talked about that a little bit, because in terms of what the battery can do, because I think we've talked a lot about the need for long duration, and now as we mentioned, your colleague was on an earlier episode. He talked about it, but talk about using a flow battery, using a vanadium battery for a shorter duration usage. For instance, like a regulation type of product or an instantaneous type of response, something like primary frequency response. Because I don't think we've talked about that yet in the context of these types of batteries.
Well, there's nothing stopping the technology from being used for that, right? You have usually your rate of response is really driven by your inverter, so you can respond within milliseconds. Okay. So that's not a problem. It's, again, if that's the only use case you're designing your project to be around, you would not put a flow battery in there, because you'd have a whole, it'd either be really expensive because you're paying for the power and the power is more expensive, or you're putting in a lot of energy that you're not using, right? So ideally, I would have an installation that would play in both, a frequency market and a capacity market. But I'd go beyond that. I think one of the underutilized uses of storage is in the wires. So putting it in the transmission grid and in the distribution grid. And this is where some of the challenges come in, because those are usually different entities that own those, and there's usually different rules for how that's governed. And I've actually seen situations where you'll have where there's a clear social benefit from putting in a battery, at the end of a long distribution line, and rather than expanding the distribution line, because again, a wire is just like, for electricity, is kind of like a highway for cars, right? If you have the ability just for a few hours a day to somehow increase the capacity or to time shift when those cars go through the highway, you don't have to add an extra lane. And that's what a battery at the end of a transmission or distribution line allows you to do. So you could use it for your kind of energy shift, but you're not only shifting the consumption, you're also shifting the transmission of the energy by locating it closer to the consumption rather than closer to the generation. But then you need market rules that allow for that value to be monetized. And I've seen situations where that's not permitted, or you have lawsuits between the generation companies, the IPPs, and the transmission infrastructure operators, saying you're taking away our market.
Well, it's been quite a debate in the United States, and in the United States, for instance, you've got FERC saying that putting out a policy statement, and there have been some orders where they basically said, look, it's going to depend on how the thing is being used. Okay, it's going to be a functionality type of a test. It basically FERC has said we're not saying that it can't be transmission, but you're going to have to make the case for it. And then in the context of the RTO markets, California, MISO, PJM, et cetera, they've basically said, look, if you sponsor a project that involves a battery, for instance, storage, and that storage product gets through the regional planning process as a transmission project, then great. They basically, I think, sent a signal that we're going to defer to the RTO planning process. But you're going to have to run that gauntlet. You're going to have to get through that regional planning process and make the case that your project performs a transmission function. And they call it non-wires alternatives. MISO, had this storage as transmission-only assets, the so-called SATOA, SATOA initiative, and there was a FERC order that said that could be okay. Excuse me, but basically, you're right. It's been a controversial debate in the United States, and I think it comes down to being able to make the case that the asset, however you design it, is performing a truly transmission function. So that's and I think from an investor perspective, then you're playing a different game. From an investor perspective, at that point, you're playing a game that says, okay, I'm going to recover my investment plus a return, on a fully regulated basis, and basically through a tariff at that point. So, and I guess from, I guess playing it out, I guess from where you're sitting, as a company that makes batteries or partners with others to make batteries, where you're sitting, that I think turns into maybe a build transfer type of arrangement where the company, the transmission owner, contracts with you to build the battery, and I put air quotes around that, but to construct the battery and install it, and then you sell it to the transmission owner, who then earns a regulated return on it, on a cost of service basis. But
well, ideally, I want to get greedy though. I want to have the transmission benefit and get paid for that, as well as the ability to bid into the capacity market when I'm not performing a transmission function, and into the frequency market when I'm not performing that function.
Well,
so if I can,
yeah.
Right?
Well, it's a cutting edge issue, honestly, Mikhail, and we've done some work on that as a firm. We've looked at that issue. Basically, from a regulator's perspective, and it is really a cutting edge issue. From a regulator's perspective, right? They look at that and they say, okay, we're going to let you recover the costs of this battery installation as part of the transmission system, which is a regulated part of the business, meaning you put in your cost of service, and we let you create a revenue requirement that you can earn on. We build a rate off of that, and we charge customers that rate, and everybody's happy. That's a traditional regulation model, right, in the United States. When it comes into market revenues, and in regulatory speak, sometimes they talk about incidental market revenues, right? So what you're saying is it performs a transmission function, but then when it's not performing a transmission function, it might be performing some other type of market, what we call a market function, making sales of energy, providing capacity, ancillary services. We talked about frequency response regulation, et cetera. Yes, I mean that's sort of like the win-win model. Where you have to solve that is you have to figure out some type of mechanism to avoid what the regulator in the United States would say is double recovery. In other words, you're fully recovering the cost of the battery on the regulated transmission side, and then on top of that, you're making market revenues. Something has to give there. You can do revenue crediting, or some other type of model, or, I mean, this is where I think people in my line of work come in, the regulatory lawyers. We could somehow come up with a way where we carve off a portion of the revenue requirement associated with the battery and say, okay, you, Bushveld, you're going to take market risk, and that you own that portion, however we divvy it up. And the transmission owner owns the rest, and they add it to their revenue requirement, and they earn on it. But that's one. Put it this way: I don't think anyone solved that one yet.
Well, so most of the countries in Africa have not unbundled. Nigeria and Kenya being some exceptions to that. There's a process of doing that, and South Africa is actually following that process right now. But the benefits of having not unbundled, which is considered a more archaic system, which is why a lot of we would say developed economies have already gone through that process, whether it was in the 90s or in the 2000s or sometimes in the 80s, and then deregulation kind of also sometimes follows that. The benefits of being bundled is that your distribution, your transmission, your generation can, they're combined. So you really don't have to figure out, you have to internally kind of account for these, but your job is to manage the system, and you just kind of go to the regulator once, and then you tell them this is what my total costs were. As long as you've done your internal kind of business cases correctly, the benefit you have is you don't have to kind of defend each little piece of where the battery adds value. But I hear what you're saying in terms of a regulator in a unbundled market will want to avoid giving a developer or owner of a system kind of the ability to double dip. But think of it also from the consumer perspective, right? Right now, as a consumer, I have to pay twice. I have to pay once for the stability of the grid, and I have to pay extra for the time shifting of the energy to avoid curtailment and all of that. So there's probably something in the middle where probably the developer gets a little bit more than they would have just by deploying as a transmission asset, or only by a capacity or an ancillary service support asset. But at the same time, the consumer is going to gain because the utilities they don't have to double up on assets. And
Right.
I think this is where storage, I think, is creating a new landscape where regulation needs to keep up and realize just that the possibilities are greater than they were before. And I think that realization is happening, but it's not there yet. That we need to think about things different. People still talk about things like base load versus peaking capacity, which is really not the way to think about a 21st century system. Those are 20th century terminologies, right? Base load, peaking, mid-merit. The 21st century is thinking about things very differently. It's around distributed generation, and this is the benefit of storage, is it can keep that energy distributed. You may not even need to wheel that energy from where it's produced, or you could wheel it at different times, and move it around. So the role of the network actually changes, and this is where regulation needs to also change and adapt. And I think that the technology is changing faster than the regulations are.
Yes. Yeah,
which may not have always been the case.
What you're saying, we've been saying for a couple of years now, is that the technology is changing much faster than the tariffs and the underlying regulatory constructs. And I think there's recognition in the United States and that we need to make some changes. Order 841 was a good first step, but I think there's a lot more coming. What I would say, by the way, with respect to unbundling and dealing with the issue of the business model that you spun out, which is, again, I think is a cutting edge model, and we've done some thinking on that, and we have some ideas on how you could solve that. But the thing is, it's easier, ironically enough, if you've got a vertically integrated entity as opposed to an unbundled one where the transmission is owned by someone else. I think one of the sort of tried and true ways in the United States that you could possibly handle a situation, and again, this is a conversation and not legal advice necessarily, but got to throw that disclaimer in, but we'll put one in at the end as well. But I think there's the concept of revenue crediting in the United States regulation, where, say, another example, taking it out of the storage space, would be if you own a transmission system, but you also make money off of renting your towers to sell cell phone companies. So in other words, tower rentals. That incidental money that comes in is traditionally revenue credited against your transmission revenue requirement, and so your transmission customers essentially get a discount for whatever that money is that you made on this other incidental business. That would be the same concept here, where you would say, listen, the main function for this asset is transmission. So if it costs $10 million, you'd get that added to your rate base. But then if there were market revenues, there was money that came in each year from providing regulation or selling energy. That whatever market revenue you came in would have to get credited against your transmission cost of service. I mean, that's the basic idea. But I think that works best, as you mentioned, when you have a vertically integrated entity. If you've got an unbundled entity, then I'm not sure how that works, because you've got two different corporate entities. And the transmission company is not going to be much interested in offering a revenue credit for something where it's not getting the revenues. So, but I think it's an interesting issue, and hopefully companies will want to hire people like me and my firm to figure it out, because I think there has to be an answer there somewhere. So, yeah, I think one of the things we talked a lot about are markets, and I think it's fascinating to get your perspective, where you're operating in South Africa, in the continent of Africa. I mean, what is your perspective on, from the company that's making the battery, selling in the market? What's your perspective on sort of contracted for revenues versus market revenues? Because that's a big paradigm. Those are two different paradigms in a way. In the United States, and a lot of times companies like traditional IPPs, I think, get comfortable with one or the other, and some companies obviously play in both. But I just wanted to get your perspective on that.
Well, I mean, the beauty is in basically nearly every single African jurisdiction, all of your kind of revenue is contracted, almost all of it. Because you basically, the structure there is you have these power purchase agreements, and the energy that you sell is contracted for. So there's no variability. So even if you're a private participant in the market, you basically have a long-term offtake from the utility or from a specific customer. Because you can also sell to private companies as well. And so you sign usually a 20-year power purchase agreement. And the only risk you might take is what might be the market price for electricity, because it's possible that will evolve over time. But even there, if these are very large capital projects, you'll actually have to have that kind of pre-agreed to as well. So actually, it creates a lot of risk, because traditionally your costs kind of in most sectors always go up a little bit, at least at the rate of inflation. So even if your inflation is very low, it's at least always going up or staying the same.
Right.
With renewable energy, that's not happening in the power sector, right? In developed economies, we're actually seeing a decrease in electricity consumption, although, with electric vehicles, that trend might get reversed a bit. But we're also seeing cost decreases, because, what you're pricing solar energy at is a whole lot cheaper than nuclear, at least new nuclear, than coal, than gas. And if it isn't yet, it will be in 1 or 2 years in almost every single jurisdiction. So you actually have a scenario where in 5 or 10 years, once some of these more expensive assets have been amortized, the cost of electricity will start coming down. But now I've signed a 20-year offtake. What am I going to, and I'm stuck with it. So there's a good chance that in 10 years or so, people will be stuck paying more for the energy than they could get if they generated themselves. But again, you got the time risk of moving later, and if there's decarbonization involved, you might move sooner. But we don't really have that issue on the continent, because very small amount of energy is actually traded. And when it is traded, it's traded between kind of utilities in the different countries through the power pools. So it's from that point of view, it's still a very much more regulated market without as much flexibility. But it is changing. These are things that are changing. But it's interesting to see how the business model and the new technologies impact those types of markets differently than they do markets that are more like the US or like Germany, where you've got a lot more uncertainty based upon what the prevailing supply and demand balance is.
Well, really interesting to hear you talk about the contracting regime, and unfortunately, in certain respects, unfortunately, I've seen that movie before, and by that I mean, you've got this question of, you were talking about, say, the cost of energy today versus what it's going to be 2 years, and then you've got a contract that runs for 15 more years, and did I peg that right? That's an issue that's been around for a long time. I started my career in the New York Public Service Commission in the late 90s, but the people who had been there for a long time told me all the war stories, so to speak, of when the PURPA, and I don't know how familiar you are with PURPA, but the law in the United States, Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act of 1978, which created a mandatory purchase obligation essentially for small renewable projects, cogen, other technologies, emerging technologies at that time. That's a concept that we could probably do a different podcast on, but the point of the point of it is it's interesting history. The point of it is, though, it was trying to jumpstart the industry of alternative energy producers, because if you go back to the 70s in the United States, obviously it was all vertically integrated, and so in any event, the point is that issue of setting the contract price correctly has been around for a long time, because it came out in that era when the New York State regulators, or New York State legislature, actually passed the so-called 6-cent law, where they pegged the price, per kilowatt hour, or whatever it was, at 6 cents, and that was wildly out of market, shortly thereafter. And then the state utilities ended up in all of these above-market contracts, and it caused massive financial problems for a number of the utilities in New York State. So the issue of how you peg the contract price correctly has certainly been around for a long time, and that's always one of the pitfalls of a contracting regime. But there's trade-offs, right? Because when you sign a 15-year deal or a 20-year deal or whatever it is, you have certainty in many respects. If you're the off-taker, I can rely on that supply. I have a contract for 15 years. Whatever the amount is, they've got to sell it to me. And so there's always trade-offs. The United States, we find ourselves, I think, a foot in both worlds. We've got all these markets that have developed, these regional markets, but in large parts of the country, we don't have those regional centralized markets. You've still got kind of a bilateral contracting regime. Mm-hmm. Even in areas where you have the so-called RTOs, you still have the ability to enter into bilateral agreements and self-schedule those agreements. For the most part, the rules will, by each region, will be a little bit different. So it's an interesting debate. I have friends in the IPP sector, and I have friends in the utility sector, and it's an ongoing debate about what do I like to play in better? Do I like to play in the markets, the pure markets, or do I like to play with the contracts? And I just think, if you're going to be in this business, you probably, in the United States, you should probably get comfortable with both, because they're both kind of here to stay, I think.
I think it's also, what are you good at, right? So if you've proven yourself to be good at one, then and I would say that there might be some complexity. There's more complexity maybe in the something that is not contracted. And if you've proven that you're not good at it, I might actually stick to the simpler one and say, all right, well, I might need to be a bit more competitive. I'm going to have probably less upside, but it's less risky, and I've proven myself to not be very good with the higher risk ones. But if you have proven that you've got, you've either done your modeling very well, and you've got the expertise, a lot of it is also based upon those kind of strengths. Where do you have capabilities within your team? Within your kind of modeling software, but I think the insight for me is always that you've got to know the market, you've got to know the landscape, and we kind of always say that regardless of whether you're working in Africa or in Australia or in the U.S., these are energy is highly regulated. You can call it deregulated, you can call it unbundled, but it still comes down to being extremely regulated, and the regulations, while they may appear you can do a lot more things, you've actually got to tick a lot more boxes, and so it's not necessarily always easier. even though you've got more options. There's more optionality, but I think it gets more complicated. So the key is, for any companies that are involved, they got to actually know the regulatory environment, and it changes by borders, and in the U.S. sometimes within the same state they might have, depending on which ISO they're in, right?
Yes, yes, absolutely. I mean, the state of Indiana, you got some portion of Indiana that's in PJM, some that's in MISO, the Midwest ISO. So, absolutely. As an example, Illinois, same thing. Um, in any event, well, I feel like we've dove into the markets and different use cases for the batteries and all that. But tell me a little bit more about Bushveld and where are we going to hear? Are we going to hear from Bushveld here in the United States? Are you guys going to become more active here? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, look, on our vanadium piece, the U.S. is actually a very big market for us. We export a lot of vanadium, ferrovanadium type products to the U.S. The U.S. does not have a lot of vanadium domestically, and so one way or another it imports it, whether it's through kind of spent catalysts or through ore. It's got to import it. So I think our position is always South Africa has been a very good and reliable trading partner for the U.S. And Bushveld's a listed company in London. South Africa has very stringent mining requirements, which maybe a lot of other jurisdictions don't. So it's always an important market for us. We hope that the trade between the two countries remains very open and forthcoming. And I think there again, if you think about where do a lot of other sources of vanadium come from, this is where I think where South Africa kind of stands apart. So for us, the U.S. market is interesting from an energy perspective. So you were talking about the projects in California that were specifically for long duration and excluded lithium. So one of the companies that we invested in, although we've since divested our shareholding, Invinity actually won some of those projects. I think they were awarded somewhere between 6 and 8 megawatt hours in those California projects. So that was quite interesting to see them be successful. They've got an office out in San Francisco, and they're kind of originally from British Columbia. So I think that vanadium itself is not really taken off as storage technology in the U.S. China is by far the leader. Japan has had quite a few large vanadium batteries, but the U.S. has been more lithium focused. So I think that's kind of both a challenge and an opportunity at the same time, because it's not as it's something that's new. I actually saw Sumitomo did a project. That's the Japanese vanadium battery company in California. So I think that it's actually more of an opportunity, but at the moment it's still it's not something that is as prevalent in this market as it is in East Asia. And again, part of it is I think that the U.S. does not have a lot of vanadium. So in China, which is half of the world's production of vanadium, they're like, well, we don't have lithium. What are we going to do? We need to put our lithium into the electric vehicles. So that policy of using that for storage, for stationary storage, made a lot of sense. And also their approach was they've had a lot of renewables, so they were trying to reduce clipping. As we learned, the U.S. market was more around. It is starting out as kind of more a short duration market. So I think it's an opportunity where we're not sure exactly how we will play into it, but definitely the companies that we've invested in are playing into it. CellCube is quite aggressive looking at the North America market, so it's going to be more through like I would say indirect means that Bushveld would be looking at it. But definitely, it's a big source of demand for us in terms of vanadium, and it's also where some of the companies that we've invested in are looking for opportunities on the energy side. I mean, my expertise, we've talked about the U.S., but I know more about the African landscape. So if all of a sudden I told my shareholders, hey, you know what, we're gonna go and do some bids in Texas and in Florida, they might say, well, your accent is okay for that, but I don't think your expertise is.
Well, we have to do a follow up episode, on the African market, because it sounds like there's a good story to tell there about the emerging opportunities, and we've had some of the early podcast episodes. We talked about some of the other bigger picture issues associated with storage. It hasn't always just been about the U.S. market, so that's something to think about us doing. But I very much enjoyed our conversation. I think we're coming towards the end of our time. Definitely appreciate you being on the program. Fascinating story about your company. And I can always get into this give and take about, well, how do we solve this regulatory issue? And so I appreciated the conversation very much. I don't know if there's anything you want to add before we wrap up about yourself, Bushveld Energy, Bushveld Minerals, or really anything else.
No, I mean, obviously, if people are interested, they can go on our website, bushveldminerals.com, bushveldenergy.com, and find out more. If you want to talk about Africa at some point, I'll be glad to come back and discuss some of the opportunities there. Likewise, there's a lot of opportunities for U.S. companies and U.S. businesses. Power Africa has been quite active now through multiple administrations, so it's actually quite good that despite the political changes, there's kind of support for developing the opportunities there, and there's a lot of demand for energy, and it's an exciting market and a big growth market as well.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Sounds fantastic. Well, appreciate you taking the time to be on our program today. Enjoyed the conversation very much. And I think that's it for today. Thanks for listening to our podcast. And like I said, we'll have to have you back, Mikhail. Thanks very much.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I've enjoyed it as well.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individual participants and not Troutman Pepper or its clients. Troutman Pepper does not make any representations or warranties, express or implied, regarding the contents of this podcast. Information on previous case results does not guarantee a similar future result. Users of this podcast may save and use the podcast only for personal or other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without the prior written permission of Troutman Pepper. If you have any questions, please contact us at troutman.com.